Hey everybody, it's Katie from Bobby Hair Studio. I'm going to teach you today how I do my Hella Blonde balayage highlights. This is my model and this is her before. She has an old grown out balayage. And this is her after. We did a good chop and we super foiled her up. So if you want to see how I do this, just stick around and watch till the end of the video. So let's get started. Here is a better view of the back of her hair. Her old balayage is super grown out. It's been like a year and a half. So what we're gonna actually do is start her off with a big chop because that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to go to more of like that long bob length. Try something new. This is great because it cuts off a lot of that old damage that we don't need to lighten. So here is my formula for her lightener. What I'm doing is I'm actually leveling up my lightener as I go. So every time I go back for a new bowl, I'm adding 20 volume to it and reducing the amount of 7 that I have in there. So it's Schwarzkopf Blonde Me and 7 volume to start. And I'm doing that because doing Hella Blonde foils takes a really long time to put into the hair. So I don't want to leave in 20 volume in the hair too long. I'm starting with something that's much more gentle and a slower lift. In order to get such a soft, rooty balayage look, even though I am doing a full head of foils, this kind of gives it that soft effect. So I am backcombing every single piece on her head that I am putting into a foil with the exception of the money piece. And what that does is it gives the money piece a little bit more of a clear, bright, vivid blonde that looks more solid because it doesn't have any little tiny baby hairs that soften up the top of it. My foiling pattern that I'm using today is I'm doing 2 slices and a weave. And when it comes to my slices, I'm not dropping anything out. If you guys have watched some of my other videos, you'll realize that whenever I do slices, I don't leave out anything. If anything, I'm just backcombing the top of them to soften the look of them, but I never leave a drop between my slices. My weave is the only area that's going to be getting some of her natural coming all the way down to the bottom. So she's still gonna maintain a super blonde look, but it's gonna soften it up a little bit by having some of those drops. And as I said earlier, I am also backcombing my weaves as well, just to maintain that softness and symmetry with the slices. I always like to foil with the back being one entire section on its own lately, and the way that I do that is I bricklay the largest, widest areas by taking one large piece and I split it down the center, or sometimes I split it into 3 pieces. This just ensures that I've got really good symmetry going on in the back and I'm not having to worry about areas that maybe I foiled a little thicker or foiled a little thinner on 2 separate sides of the back of the head. This just makes it really symmetrical in my opinion. Now here is a close-up of how I actually load on the lightener and blend. I do like to load on the lightener with my brush being horizontal because it gives an even saturation, and then I turn my brush vertical because it puts more pressure onto these areas where I can sink all the way down through to the bottom of the foil and get really good coverage on all of the hair. This is a really good way to get a really soft result in your foiling because when you're using both backcombing and you're flicking up the color to blend up towards the backcombing, you're not getting a strong line anywhere. So this is really helpful to new hairstylists everywhere, that if you use flicking motions like this, you're gonna get wispy looking ends to your blonde and not a big strong line that you're gonna have to cover over with a drop root, which is what I do over the end anyways. I always love to do a drop root on all my foiling services because it just adds that little bit of softness and blend and transition between 2 colors. Now it's time to move on to the front of the hair. What I'm doing on these two sides is a little bit different than what I did on the back. I'm actually just doing everything as a slice. I'm not leaving out any drops. And the reason being is because the front hair is a little bit more widely dispersed, and so it's a little easier to backcomb more hair up towards the root where that doesn't end up getting bleached. So I know this from a little bit of experience with this, that I can accidentally backcomb a little bit too much and then also leave out drops, making the front actually slightly darker than the back, and we don't want that. So I'm doing just slices because it backcombs easier in the front. So that does mean that I'm having a softer shadow up near the front. Keep that in mind. If you watch how I'm about to backcomb right here, you can see all these little baby hairs being collected up near the top. All of those are going to create a shadow and some blend. So you just want to make sure that you don't put too much of that away because it's not going to get lightened, and you want to make sure that everything that is lightened is placed where you want it and it's there for a reason. Now comes time to foil up the money piece in the front. What you'll notice is I'm, again, not backcombing like I stated earlier. I'm weaving everything in, but there's no drops in between my weaves. The way that I do this is just to ensure that I have a really soft root, again, like the backcombing, but there isn't anything left out. This is just softening up that line that's going to appear there. So this is how I do my weaving. Again, nothing's being left out. This is a good way to actually do some color corrections where you have to solidly make somebody blonde, but they still want a root. You just pull up the section, weave out what you want, put everything back into the section that you're not using. I always make sure that my money piece is substantially larger than I think it should be whenever I'm doing a super hella blonde color correction like this, because I want to make sure that it actually stands out from the rest of the blonde. It might seem like it's too much, but once you see all these foils come out, it almost kind of disappears on its own. Now that we're removing her foils, you're gonna see how light she lifted to. Her hair is beautiful. There's basically no breakage there, and we're ready to start detangling once we rinse her out and purple shampoo her. Now it's time for me to apply the root shadow. Today I'm using Schwarzkopf Vibrance 8-11, 9-0, and 6 volume lotion. I basically use equal parts, and I like to use this for level 7s and higher. I basically always like to formulate my root shadow to be a level higher than someone's natural root because it tends to take very well into newly bleached areas. So if I were to formulate on level or slightly lower, it would look like almost like a dark bar in their hair, and that's just not what we want to have. Once I've applied my root shadow formula, I am going to let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to mix up my mids to ends formula, and then I'm going to blend them together. My mids to ends toner is Schwarzkopf Blonde Me Tea Ice and Blonde Me 7 Volume. This gets mixed with equal parts, so I put that together, and I love using it for honestly almost all of my platinum blondes because it cools down a lot of their yellow and orange tones while maintaining the rest of their hair and the brightness of everything. If you don't want it to be as icy, you can mix in Blonde Me Sand, or you can mix in one of the other colors to kind of play around with the tones. But I always feel like ice should be a good 3/4 of your formula at least, so you get a really good control and evening out of your canvas. Now that she's washed out and toned, I'm just going to do her cut. I do like to separate the two front sections along the parting and then behind the ears. And her back section, I like to tilt my client's head down so that I can cut the bottom few sections of her hair around until I get to the occipital bone, and then I make them put their head back up at a neutral angle. But this is how I like to do all of my haircuts. I just like to hold down with my fingers and do a little bit of a chipping in rather than a straight across cut. I find that that gives a softer looking edge. Even when someone wants something blunt, I do this just because it gives them a little bit of shaping and moving around for their ends, and it doesn't give that kind of chunky look at the very ends. And here is a little hot tip for all of you stylists out there. Whenever you're doing haircuts and you find that the edges are too blunt, this is what I do to soften up the blunt edges. I basically bring everything down to the bottom, make sure it sits to my guideline, and then I actually, instead of cutting where my guideline is, I usually like to cut about 1 millimeter down further so that I don't get a hard looking edge. I get a really soft, diffused looking edge. With the front, I always like to give it a slight angle because it allows for my client who's going from a really long length to a shorter length to kind of get comfortable with their new haircut, but they almost always decide for me to even it up and make it a one length cut. That's an easy thing to do. It only takes a couple of seconds, but I do like to start on an edge so they can get used to their new length. The front is what matters the most to a lot of clients, I find, so you can always cut more hair off. You can't add more hair on. Once I finish my perimeter cut, I like to blow dry the hair, and I do any kind of layering and texturizing when the hair is dry. What I like to do is I like to fan out the hair once I've pulled out a section and chip into it quite heavily, and then take off that top corner so that the top of the hair bevels in towards the bottom. What this does is it actually loosens up some of the weight in the very bottom layers, and it just very slightly layers the top layer of the hair. As you can see here, that nice fanning motion spreads open the hair and gives me a lot of control with where I'm removing the weight and where I am texturizing the hair. I do this all the way around the head, and it just softens up the whole look all over and gives them a little bit of lightweight texture for when they get their hair curled or straightened. It's just easier to style. And here she is. Here's her final look. You can see a little bit of that texturizing that gives her a little bit of body with her curls. She didn't want anything super layered or anything. She wanted something a little bit more blunt looking, so we stayed with what we had, and it just gives her a little bit of versatility with her styling. Her color is gorgeous. Her money piece barely stands out, even though as I told you guys earlier, I did like 6 or 7 pieces in the front for the money piece. It barely is there, so always err on the side of more blonde when you're doing a hella blonde appointment like this, whenever you're doing the money piece. I'm loving how this one turned out, you guys. Let me know how you feel in the comments, and thank you for watching.